I'm not going to explain too much about the application and definition of ISO, exposure value, aperture, and shutter speed. I'm just going to demonstrate some useful bracketing functions on Sony cameras. Likely you have these in other cameras as well, but these are the cameras that I'm familiar with. First of all, we should talk about high dynamic range, which basically is how the camera tries to expose for the bright and darkest areas of your image. In Sony cameras and likely other cameras, they have a DRO optimizer or dynamic range optimizer, where you can use a high DRO, meaning maximize the way how the camera tries to give a good exposure between the brightest and the darkest areas, or use the lowest setting, meaning it doesn't apply that effect too much. A lot of people say you should just use 2, don't go for the max. That kind of works with a lot of different things. So bracketing just basically means you can shoot round about the center value, or what you see as the ideal exposure. So let's say, for example, you set a particular exposure, you can take a couple of images below that exposure and above that exposure, and then in post you can merge them together to get a wonderfully exposed high dynamic range image. The first thing I like to do is change the bracketing settings, which means I can just put a timer. So self timer during bracketing just means it will start taking these pictures 2 seconds after I press it. That's the first thing. Otherwise, if you rely on your finger to stay still or your hand to stay still, you probably will get some ghosting, as they call it, which basically means motion between shots. The other thing I like to do is change the order of these bracketed images. So for this one, it will display the center exposure first, then the exposure that's below the 0, and then the high exposure above that. I like to go minus 0 plus. So in Sony cameras, you got a bunch of options. You got continuous bracketing, white balance bracketing, and DRO bracketing. Once you understand continuous bracketing, I skipped over this one, you will know what single bracketing is, so I'll just talk about this one. So with the difference between the two, continuous bracketing, you can shoot 3 images with increments of 0.3 exposure value or exposure compensation values. You can adjust that to be 5 images of increments of 0.3, or 9 images, and so on. You can also adjust the increments, so 3 at 0.5 and so on and so forth. The difference between the continuous and the single is that you just press the shutter once for continuous and it takes the prescribed number of shots. With the single, as it says, each time you press the shutter. So you gotta press the shutter each time. So for example, it's just gonna take 1 shot. So it will take 1 shot each time. That's very risky because it increases the chance that you will have a shift in the position or a shift in the composition, and you'll get some motion, right? All right, so that's for exposure compensation. On the left, I'll keep the merged photo, and on the right, I'll show you the comparison between the bracketed images. So I'll click the change. You can see that in all of these bracketed images, the one that comes the closest, this one's obviously too dark. The ones on the extreme are too white. These two are the closest. Even so, as I remember it, I could get more. As I remember it, the sky was more like this on that day. This was just a couple of days ago. Now with the dynamic range and the merged photo, you get a whole lot more detail without blowing out the sky. So there's more detail in the shadows here and detail is lost on the individual images. All right, so you can see the merged photo on the left is a whole lot more detail here. And the sky is not completely blown out. You can also see that it's the same ISO for all the images, but the exposure is changed by the camera adjusting the shutter speed. So let's look on the right. So the longest shutter speed would be the brightest image. Shortest shutter speed would be the darkest image. And the ones in between, you see how that changes. That's the camera doing that. Just depends on the settings. If you have it on aperture priority or shutter priority, the machine would change the other setting. Ideally, I prefer the merged one. I think it's pretty clear. It has an overall nice image with good detail in the sky, good detail in the shadows, and the colors look more authentic. All right, let's try the other bracketing options. The next one we should talk about is white balance bracket, where the camera tries to take images below and above the set white balance that you have in the camera, and then you can merge them, but it just uses the white balance as a bracketing option. And the same thing, you can adjust the range. So this one can be high or low. Just two options to this one. That just means 3 images and small differences in white balance at a time. That's for low. And for high, 3 images with large differences. So one's 3 images with small differences. The other one is 3 images with large differences. So on the left is the merged image. I just labeled it export. If you see export, that means I already merged it. The merged raw image. And on the right is the bracketed white balance option. Now first, let's change these and take a look over here. You'll see that nothing changes. So the camera settings stay the same. That's because it's just adjusting the white balance in camera, nothing to do with the exposure. Right, so everything stays the same. However, you can see that the colors change ever so subtly. Now I have it on white balance low, but the colors change ever so subtly. See that? But you can see a little yellow tint, or I don't know what you call that, but it's a shade off than the true green that's over here in the merged photo. That's mostly because for me, I have the benefit of looking at this next to the merged photo. This by itself, this image by itself on the right, a lot of us would think it's okay, at least for the untrained eye like myself. But now that we have the benefit of the merged photo, we can see the sky isn't as blown out. We can appreciate that the sky is still a little, there's more detail in here on the merged photo. And we still have a good amount of detail in the shadows. Right? If we blow that out, you can see we still have a lot of detail on the merged photo here on the left. Over here is compromised, right? So the problem with trying to do this without bracketing is unless you're going to edit in post, quite often if you're shooting for the dark areas, you're going to blow out the white areas. And if you're exposing to darken the light areas, then you're going to lose detail in the dark area. It's going to be too black. So with white balance, it's the same thing. So if you try to go on one extreme or the other, it's going to be either too yellow or too warm or too cold kind of thing. I think I'm explaining that right. This one is the closest to it. And even so, the one in the middle, that is the 0. Even so, you can see the sky is a little bit too blown out. And the trees aren't as green as I remember it. The road is also a little bit yellow if you compare the two. Now this is all subtle and up to your taste. Let's try another set. On the left is the raw version, but this is the high setting. On the right is the unmerged bracketed options. This is one extreme. This is the one in the middle. This is the one on the right. You can still see for each of them, the sky is a little bit blown out. And the overall picture has a tint to it, right, in all the images. And none of the three bracketed images in white balance option have good detail in the shadows. None of them, as compared to the bracketed merged option. So this is the merged option on the left. These are the unmerged images on the right. None of them have as much detail as the merged option. Let's see, now that you're looking at it up close, you can see that this looks more realistic. The one on the left looks more realistic in green color than this one. This is a car cover, and this is closer to the color that I remember than this one. All right, I think we just have one more option to go through. The last one is DRO bracket. This just uses the dynamic range optimizer as the bracketing option. So I'll show you what that means. You have two options, by the way, low and high. With low, you can take 3 images with level 1, level 2, and level 3. And I think for high, it's level 1, 3, and 5. So you're using a wider range of dynamic range optimizer in the camera. It just depends on your taste. I'll show you what these look like. So the one on the left is the merged version. The one on the right is the unmerged version. So just the bracketed photos. Immediately you can tell that this one has a better view of the sky. It's more realistic. You can see some clouds here. Over here you can't even tell if that's all of it's cloud or there's no detail in here. So for example, if we zoom in on this area, you can't tell where the clouds are, right? We just make it apples for apples. But on this one, you can see that there's cloud. There are clouds in the sky. Let's change to the other options. This is the one in the middle, the exposure in the middle. Same thing, the sky doesn't have any detail on the DRO optimizer in the middle. And the one on the right, still no detail, especially in the shadows. All of this just looks black, right? The shadows, everything dark, just has much more detail once the photos are merged. So the only thing left to do is for us to see how do all of these different bracketing options compare. Let's do just that. So you want to look in this little box over here where I've labeled them DRO, white balance, WB, and white balance, low, and continuous bracketing, which uses exposure value. I'll just tell you which one is which in case it's hard to see on the screen. So right now on the screen, we have on the right, we have the merged continuous bracketing using exposure value. And on the left, we have the merged using DRO. So we can choose between these two. Even though it's different shots, unfortunately, this is how I had it, but it's different framing. But let's see what we can get from it. If you will take a look at, say, the sky, for example, I would say the sky looks really nice on the one with the exposure bracketing or the exposure value. The greens look really vibrant. I like that. And the shadows look just about the same. Again, it's a little bit darker on this side of the street at the time of day. Now let's look at the other one. So comparing the white balance low on the left, white balance high on the right. This is a more fair comparison, and it's more similar framing. I would say the white balance high has a better depiction of the sky, more detail in the sky, and what we can see of the roofs over here and the siding. I would say the white balance high has a better dynamic range depiction. I hope I'm describing that right. But I would prefer this image. Let's just say that, the one on the right. So if we're going to pick a winner out of the white balance bracketing high and low, we'll pick the high. So let's get rid of the low and put maybe the exposure value bracketing or the continuous bracketing on the left, and the white balance high on the right. Again, exposure bracketing looks really vibrant. Haven't lost a lot. The greens look similar, but the white balance greens, I prefer this one. This is my preference on the right. Let's just zoom into a similar area, which would be about here by the fire hydrant. No, it's not really a fair comparison because it was pointing in a different direction, so the sun was in a different part of the sky with respect to the angle of the camera. However, this is the best I got right now. All right, so I prefer these greens for the continuous bracketing. For the white balance high, I would say, sorry. White balance high looks better overall. Now, it would just depend on your taste. It makes sense to me because then the colors will be more accurate if the camera is trying to adjust for the range of white balances in the shot, right? It averages them out. So it takes one below what you set, one above, and one right in the middle, and gives you a good balance of all three. It makes sense why this one's the best. I'm not sure which one I would use, but so that's the benefit of using merged photos or bracketing options. Now, I think this is most useful for still photos, so things that are not moving. So your landscape, someone who could stay still for 2 seconds or so, or however long it takes to capture these images. But anything moving, you're gonna have problems because it's gonna be blurry and things are gonna look a little bit weird. I also heard that you should expose, when you're using bracketing, you should expose for the brighter areas of the image. I didn't make a distinction. I just pointed the camera in a general direction and exposed, and it worked just fine, at least for my purposes, to my untrained eye. But bracketing is very, very useful. I might start using this more often. No, I missed some opportunities before. I'm not going to make that option anymore. So I have set this to a menu function that allows me to access it really quickly. So I can turn the DRO optimizer up to 5 or down to 1 very quickly. But I think it's useful, and I hope it helps somebody else. It's just fascinating to learn about these options. All right, take it easy.